If someone asked you to name the top 5 presidents in American history, who would you name? On most people's list, Abraham Lincoln would definitely be one of them, and they wouldn't be wrong in saying that he should be on their list. He's done so much for our country. The Civil War had torn apart the United States and had to be put back together, basically rebuilt from scratch and reborn once the smoke of the Civil War cleared. Abraham Lincoln saw the country through its greatest test of its democracy and had a vision set in mind on what to do once the Civil War was over, what to do with the rebellious states, and how to reunite the two regions back together. In his victory speech, he focused on moving past the Civil War and reconciling with the South. But he didn't just want this. He was the one who created the Emancipation Proclamation and wanted to see that his freed black slaves would be taken care of. His Vice President Johnson was already a symbol of the reunification, but Lincoln never got to see his plans go through. He never got to see his country that he led out of the Civil War go through Reconstruction successfully, as he was shot in the back of the head days after the Civil War ended by John Wilkes Booth. So this inspired the question, what would Reconstruction look like if Lincoln had survived? How would race relations and regional relations have been different today if Lincoln was not assassinated? First, let's talk about what actually happened in this period. We know the history of the Civil War. South secedes, war begins, South loses. Days after the war, Lincoln was killed in Ford's Theater by pro-Southern fanatic John Wilkes Booth, and the plans for Reconstruction was put in the hands of Johnson, a Tennessean Southern Democratic who refused to secede with the state. Before the war, Andrew Johnson fought against abolition and said that all men are created equal did not apply to blacks. A white supremacist, he had no love for the freed blacks, and his only goal was to reunite the southern states as quick as possible. Lincoln appointed him vice president as he was a symbol for reuniting the North and South. He did not intend for him to rise to power and take control of Reconstruction as he later did. And Andrew Johnson was no Lincoln. He did not have a plan, or rather a successful plan in mind, that would solve all the issues the nation faced after the Civil War. So what were the problems? The Civil War dealt with slavery and secession, and key challenges started to face the nation once it was over. First was, how do we bring the South back into the Union? How do we have reunification and reconciliation? Another issue was, how do we rebuild the South after its destruction during the war? The third thing is, how do we integrate and protect newly emancipated black freedmen? Finally, the question was, what branch of government should control this process of Reconstruction? Should it be Congress or the President? And we see disagreements over that as well. Even questions like, what do you do with the former Confederate leaders? Should they be punished or pardoned? Questions like these needed answering, and who was there to answer them? An egotistical and stubborn Andrew Johnson. Johnson saw himself as a representation of poor Southern whites, and so Reconstruction in his mind was to help out the poor Southern whites, not the matter of civil rights for the newly freed blacks. It was about bringing relations between North and South back together, and this was the mindset he had that guided him through all the horrible decisions he had made. Instead of fixing issues like racial differences, he had made the problems worse. This was a reason that put him in constant conflict with the Radical Republicans. Radical Republicans were a faction of the Republicans that aimed for more civil rights towards the black people in the South. They were radical because the thought of giving blacks the right to vote and pushing for civil rights and economic opportunities for former slaves called freedmen was a radical idea. So what made Reconstruction viewed as one of the lowest points in the saga of American democracy? Why did Reconstruction not work out as planned? And instead of bridging the gap between blacks and whites, why did it rather widen it? In my opinion, the fault could be attributed to Johnson. His stubborn nature led to an unrelenting opposition to the Republican-dominated Congress. His countless vetoes, like when he vetoed the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau and vetoed the Civil Rights Bill, led Congress to hate him even more and push even harder to give the blacks their civil rights, something the South hated. It led Congress to pass the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gave civil rights and suffrage to blacks. The hatred for Johnson led Congress to gain even more influence as time went on, and as the crucial congressional election of 1866 was fast approaching, and Johnson, trying to secure a majority on his soft on the South policy, ruined his chance by going on an unsuccessful swing around the circle speeches. It led Congress to gain enough ballots to have a two-thirds majority, something that would let them do whatever they wanted without the veto power of Johnson. The control of Reconstruction would rapidly go in the hands of the radical Republicans in Congress, and this was not good. Radical Republicans, as radical as they are, didn't realize that it takes time for wounds to heal. You can't take away everything that made the South, its slaves, and still expect them immediately to accept it. The approach that radical Republicans took by basically enforcing its policies by passing the Reconstruction Act would do more harm than actual good. Basically, it divided the South into 5 military districts and assigned a Union general to command each district. It was a military occupation of the South to make sure Reconstruction was being followed. All of the former Confederates in the South were disenfranchised, and the 10% government that were put in place by Johnson were ruled invalid. To be readmitted, the Southern states had to create a new constitution that included the right for black suffrage for blacks, and the states had to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendment. And now, what you see happening under Congregational or Radical Reconstruction was the South was temporarily experiencing a social and political revolution. African American men are voting. Kind of symbolic of this revolution is Hiram Revels, who was elected in 1870 to the seat that Jefferson Davis used to hold. So you got groups of African American senators and congressmen taking power in the South. Southern plantation owners are seeing their former slaves, which they used to beat with whips, now holding office and gaining power, and this kind of rapid revolution was what led them to hate the blacks even more. Slowly, Reconstruction falls apart. Groups like the KKK are established in 1868 as a terrorist organization, and its sole purpose is to secure white supremacy and violently resist Reconstruction governments, using force to instill fear in blacks and scalawags who were Southern whites who cooperated with Reconstruction and wanted peace. They prevented them from voting. The government tries to deal with this resistance by passing the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871 by basically sending federal troops in to stop his resistance groups like the KKK. But as time went on, acts like the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which gives equal access to public places and protects the right to serve on juries, starts to become less influential and rarely enforced, and eventually overturned in Supreme Court in 1883. By the mid to late 1870s, Congress and President Grant and even Republicans in the North would be unwilling to use federal government's power to monitor Southern society, and as a result, Reconstruction slowly breaks apart. Eventually, after a public scandal and a public losing interest in Reconstruction efforts, the new president, Rutherford B. Hayes, brought federal troops out of the South, marking the end of Reconstruction. Without the federal government intervening, the South slowly went back to segregating the black population through things like the Jim Crow laws, which mandated the segregation of public schools, public places, and public transportation, and the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, drinking fountains for whites and blacks. The Old South was rather resurrected than reconstructed. So, what would have changed with Lincoln? How would Reconstruction have looked like under Lincoln's leadership? Unfortunately, we don't know since he was assassinated, but that doesn't stop many historians and myself to speculate on what could have gone different during Reconstruction, and how would Reconstruction have been successful with Lincoln in charge instead of Johnson. Ironically, Lincoln at the end of the war was similar to Johnson in the way that he wanted the Union to get quickly back together. It was rather Lincoln's plan to create the 10% governments, and this would have put him against odds with the radical Republicans, just like Johnson, and they would have probably treated him as much as they did with Andrew Johnson if Lincoln refused to go along with their plans. But this alternate reality where Lincoln clashes with Congress and gets impeached like Johnson seems rather unlikely. There was one key difference that made Lincoln different than Johnson, one key difference that would have led him down a different path than Johnson. The hallmark of Lincoln's greatness was his ability to grow and his willingness to change his mind. During the war, he had come to embrace a radical position on immediate emancipation and enlistment of black soldiers. He had initially declared that the Civil War was a war to preserve the Union, but that quickly changed to a goal of emancipation. It was his willingness to see the bigger picture and his open-mindedness that would have led him to compromise with Congress and come up with a better plan on how to reconstruct the South. Andrew Johnson lacked Lincoln's qualities of greatness. While Lincoln had been open-minded, willing to listen to criticism, attuned to the currents of Northern public opinion, and able to get along with all the elements of his party, Johnson was stubborn, deeply racist, and insensitive to the opinions of others. It is impossible to imagine Lincoln, had he lived, become so alienated from Congress. Lincoln had grown enormously during the Civil War, and his ideas would have undoubtedly have continued to evolve during Reconstruction. Even if, like Johnson, he had set in motion the establishment of all Southern states back into the Union, he undoubtedly would have listened carefully to complaints about the Black Codes and been willing to heed the outcry in the North for further guarantees of the rights of former slaves. It was Johnson's intransigence that pushed moderates towards the radical position, thus resulting in the Reconstruction Acts. Had Congress and Lincoln reached a agreement in 1866, universal black male suffrage would not have followed, at least not immediately. This was a key development if we wanted to see the South slowly revolutionized instead of forcing black suffrage in their face and hating the race even more. So what would have occurred in this alternate timeline? How the events have played out in this new reality? Lincoln had won the Civil War. Thus, people in the North and in Congress would have trusted him more to know how to deal with fixing the South than they had trusted Johnson with. The whole period of Reconstruction would have been a much less radical agenda. If Lincoln was president, his principal goal would have been to reunite the Union as smoothly as possible, but based on different circumstances. Slavery still resembled the South in the form of sharecropping, which was basically an exploitative and soul-intensive system that endured for several generations, and in the form of black codes, which was Southern defiance to Union victory in the Civil War and its Reconstruction efforts. It was basically substituted the word black from slavery. These black codes' purpose was to secure a steady labor supply. Blacks who jumped their labor contracts would be punished with penalties and fines, and their wages were kept pretty low. It forbade blacks from serving on a jury or renting or leasing land. This was something Lincoln would not take lightly. This was something that made a mockery of Lincoln's victory in the Civil War and his Emancipation Proclamation, and would be not allowed. In this alternate timeline, Lincoln would pass a similar version of his 10% plan, which would only allow Southern states back into the Union if they included in their new constitution that laws that would subjugate the economic progress of these newly freed blacks would not be made. In return, Lincoln and Congress would establish a federal organization called the Freedmen's League, which would give the South what it wanted, which was a steady labor supply, now that the blacks were emancipated. In this new federal organization, Southern farmers will be given a steady labor supply by assigning voluntary for a freedman to go work for a plantation owner under loose contracts that wouldn't punish blacks for jumping their labor contract, which was often rigged anyways by Southern farmers by making sure they're always in debt to them, so that they'll always have to keep working to pay off that debt. Also in this league, it promised to have minimum wage that would be very adequate for both parties. From the establishment of this league, all three parties benefited. The South would get its labor supply, thus doesn't need to create a corrupt sharecropping behaviors. Lincoln gets what he wants by quickly putting the Union back together, and the Republican Congress gets what it wants by not allowing the black codes to pass. Another event that would have been significant would have been the passing for the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866, which would have educated more blacks in the economic prosperity and how to live more independently. This peaceful compromise between the three parties would have led to many of the practices passed by the radical Republicans like the 14th and 15th Amendment to not have been passed. Because Lincoln would not have vetoed the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, Congress would not have struck back with a Civil Rights Bill. Thus, they wouldn't be threatened to quickly get the Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which would constitutionally guarantee civil rights for blacks and strike down the black codes. Without the 14th Amendment passing, the 15th Amendment would not transpire either. Of course, this means that blacks don't immediately get civil rights or the right to vote, but the slow development is crucial if Lincoln and the Congress want the South to not retaliate and actually accept Reconstruction efforts. The clash between Congress and President would not have occurred in our alternate timeline, and Lincoln would have no need to be going on a famous swing around the circle speeches like Johnson did to gain the votes for a congressional election of 1866. Because of the more acceptance of Lincoln as a great leader that would guide the Reconstruction efforts, Congress would not have gotten a majority, thus wouldn't have gotten all the power in the Reconstruction efforts. With the power of veto of any of the radical congressional efforts, which wouldn't have occurred in an alternate timeline anyways, acts like the Reconstruction Act would not have developed. The region would not be divided into 5 districts, and military troops would not have been deployed to enforce Reconstruction efforts, as Southern societies would already be accepting them. Without the white Southern folks seeing black men take office and quickly rising to power, white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan would not have materialized to instill fear into the black population. Radical Reconstruction would be no more, and rather in its place would take peaceful or moderate Reconstruction. A more moderate Reconstruction, backed by a united Republican Party and overseen by Lincoln's leadership, would definitely have sunk in deeper roots than the radical Reconstruction. Over time, through the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau and the federal government, blacks would become more educated, more literate, and more independent to lead their own lives. So although civil rights or suffrage would not have existed immediately, at least it would have been prevented the long nightmare of disenfranchisement, segregation, and racial violence that followed the end of Reconstruction. Generations would have passed, and the wounds of the Civil War would slowly go away. Over time, as the southern white population becomes more acceptant for blacks, the freedmen will start to see their destined civil rights be given to them. In the end, Lincoln would have drastically changed the outcome of Reconstruction. National strife and racial differences would gradually evaporate, and the wounds of war would slowly heal.